Welcome to this episode of the Mormon Expositor podcast. I'm your host for this episode, Matthew Crowley. I have with me today to cover the Sunday morning session of General Conference, two distinguished guests. The first is Jonee Woodward. Jonee, welcome back.
Thanks, Matthew. I sure appreciate you asking me on.
Did you just say sure appreciate you?
Sorry. I live in Utah.
Yeah, but you can be in it, but not of it. I mean, geez.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
And we also have with us from an undisclosed location, Chris. Chris, you've, I think, said that you were on an early Voices episode and also have been on conference reviews before. Is that right?
That's right. It's good to be back.
Yeah, welcome. Well, before we jump in, since we know that here at Mormon Expositor that these conference reviews are by far the most popular thing that we do, and I have a little bit of a captive audience. I'll mention two things real quickly. If you've never listened to us before, or if you're just coming on to listen to conference reviews, please be aware that we do a lot more than just this. We release podcasts at least every other week, have a lot of exciting things coming up. Please check out our website. If you haven't found it there already, it's at www.mormonexpositor.com. Check out what we've done in the past, and please give us a listen in the future. The other thing that I'll pitch to you real quick is that we are made possible through the generous support and donations of the people who listen to our podcast. We, of course, don't make anything or pay ourselves for it, but we do have equipment and other costs that we count on folks to help us with. So if you're able to, or if you're looking for a substitute for tithing, please consider us. There's a donate button on the website. So let's go ahead and dive into the talks. Well, before we get into that, anybody have any general comments about opening prayer, opening song, anything in general about the appearance?
It was another sister prayer, which is something.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's interesting, I suppose, given the backdrop of the women lining up the night before for the priesthood session. For those who don't think that makes any difference, that's a concession that's already been made. Jonee, anything you noticed?
I just thought there was a lot of focus on endure to the end, and I have a couple of opinions on that, but that seemed to be a long-term focus during these talks this time.
Yeah, especially this session seemed to focus on that, yeah.
So, President Eyring, who wants to sort of introduce his talk?
I'll give a summary of it.
Go ahead, Chris.
Okay. I'm often asked for advice about marriage. Each couple is different, so it's hard to give specific advice, but God's plan to happiness is exactly the same for everyone. The great key to family happiness is, of course, to accept all your church callings. That's how you get the Holy Ghost. And without the Holy Ghost, how can you have a happy marriage?
So, Jonee, you agreed with all of that, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's the only way you can handle your passive-aggressive wife.
Yeah, so tell us what you mean about that. Unpack that a little.
Okay, so Eyring, starts this entire talk beautifully. I love the fact that he finally tells us why he blubbers through every talk that he gives, and that's because he has a chemist for a dad, but he has an artist for a mom. So yeah, he is a scientist, but he just cannot not cry when he's up on the podium. So that made a lot of sense to me. So he was talking about the fact that if you have the Holy Ghost as your companion through spiritual service and through the atonement, then your marriage will be happier. And he gave us this great example that really encapsulates the Mormon culture's passive-aggressive nature. So he talks about how his dad had worked in New Jersey for years as a chemist, while his mom's widowed mother and her unmarried sister had passed away here in Utah. Obviously, that was really hard for her. So Eyring's dad finally gets a job opportunity here in Utah. And he goes to his mom, like all good patriarchs do, and says, honey, what should I do? And as all good LDS women do, she says, do what you think is best, dear. So, of course, because it was probably for BYU and not near as prestigious nor probably paid as well. He did what he thought was best and he turned it down. So Irene then indicates that the next day his mom wrote his dad a letter. She didn't talk with him. She didn't communicate her issues face to face. She needed to write him a letter. And essentially in this letter, she reminded Irene, this is Irene Sr., of course, that he had promised her many, many years before that any opportunity that he had gotten to go back to Utah, that he would take that.
And didn't he tell her, or didn't she tell him, take this letter and don't read it here, but open it at your office?
Yes, absolutely. And so then essentially Irene puts in, well, if my dad had been listening to the Holy Ghost when she said, do what is best, or do what you think is best, he would have known and he would have remembered this. But obviously she had to write him the letter because he was supposed to remember this promise that he had made to her years and years and years ago. For me, this just encapsulates Mormons' passive-aggressive nature, where they pride themselves on never causing contention. But boy, if you forget something that somebody else thinks that you should remember, they are going to let you have it behind your back. And so, of course, Irene brings this back to the Lord and says, but the Holy Ghost softened my dad's heart, and he called the company back. I'm sure it was BYU, but I have no idea.
No, University of Utah.
Oh, okay. Well, University of Utah, and said, no. Remember when I told you no on that job? Actually, I really meant yes. And they lived happily ever after.
When I was listening to that, I had the same thought that you did. I thought, I hate that. I mean, I hate it when, somebody does that to me. I mean, basically, she set up a test for him that she knew he was going to fail, or that potentially he was going to fail. I mean, President Eyring told, I think, an anecdote earlier in the talk about how this was the man who, had to be dragged to the symphony and one time stood up before it was over because when it was over, but before the applause had started, because he didn't know any better. I mean, so she's got to know who her husband is. So she, rather than just be direct and say, well, yeah, actually I do have an opinion. As you know, for all these years, blah, blah, blah. She sets up a test for him that he then fails. And then this is, held out as, this is how we become one in a marriage. And I'm thinking,
right.
If my spouse does that to me, it pisses me off. We all have blind spots. We don't all the time, remember everything or know everything that we're supposed to do. I mean, maybe we should, but it just feels like it's more conducive to happy married life to simply say what you want.
Well, and it's kind of a failure as an analogy, because it's supposed to show how the Holy Ghost helps you as a couple, but the Holy Ghost didn't tell the wife to speak to her husband directly. It didn't tell the husband to remember what the wife said, and it didn't tell the wife to then go talk to her husband and address her issues rather than writing it in a letter or something like that. So
yeah.
I think one sentence that needs to be called out is that he reiterates that there is joy guaranteed for the faithful. And I think it's something, again, that comes up a lot in the talks in this session, is that, hey, as long as you endure and as long as you're faithful, things will work out. And I think it's going to come up as a theme, and it's a bad way to say it, but like holding hostage happiness for commitment to the church.
Yeah. So there was one thing that I did like from this talk. One of the things that he said, and I think he said it twice, maybe said it two different ways, is, and I'm going to overlook that it's slightly condescending, but he made the point that you can't sort of force righteousness on others, but that you can show them that you're happy and that you can take some comfort from the fact that, from a faithful Mormon perspective, that at some point everyone was together and happy as a family in the preexistence and hoping to come down, et cetera, et cetera. I always listen to these talks with an ear to, how is this landing on my faithful family? And especially whenever they get into the topic of, people who are straying or, people who are not keeping the commandments. Are they encouraging them to be tolerant? Or they, how are they encouraging them to think? And it may be in a small way, but I like that he's saying here, don't try to force things on anybody else. You simply can't do that. Just show them that you're happy. And he doesn't quite say it, but I'm sort of reading into that. Love them anyway. So that I liked. There are others who have stated that not as kindly as he has. All right. So Elder Oaks, this is an interesting talk. I've had a lot of conversation already today with people about this to sort of it's difficult to sum up this talk because he kind of jumps all over the place, but the overarching theme of it is the first two of the 10 Commandments, which are you can't have any other gods before God, and then don't have any graven images and bow down and serve them. And he sort of covers a number of topics where he jumps from the church's perspective on marriage and homosexuality, and marriage and at what point and at what age you should do that, and gay marriage, and all sorts of other things, and basically circles back around to say, if you are not orthodox on things, then you are a moral coward, and he used those words, you're a moral coward, and that you are guilty of breaking those first two commandments because you are essentially worshiping a graven image. There's, I think, a lot here to unpack. Does anybody want to jump in with sort of whatever jumped out to them as the biggest issue or first thing they want to discuss?
Oh, where to start? This is one of those talks that I think is going to go down in history as the reason that ex-Mormons leave the church. Like, I think that a couple years down the line, we're going to hear people who are like, oh yeah, that Elder Oaks talk. That's when I realized that the stuff that I saw as reality and stuff that the church was preaching just wasn't compatible. And I knew then that I just had to leave.
Yeah, I think that may be true. Let me hang a little more meat on the bones. So when he talks about what some of the graven images that people serve are, he goes through a long laundry list. I don't know if I got all of them here, but I wrote down several: cultural and family traditions, political correctness, career, power, materialism. I think prestige may have been one of them.
Recreational pursuits. Yeah,
recreational pursuits. The one that, just to my ears, just sort of stung the most was political correctness. Mm-hmm. That's a term that I don't hear people use almost at all anymore. I mean, seems like that 10 or 15 years ago, and well, maybe that's because I lived in Utah 10 or 15 years ago, but I used to always hear people complaining about political correctness. And I mean, what is political correctness other than essentially showing sensitivity? And usually we're talking about racial sensitivity or gender sensitivity, or sensitivity of some other kind towards a class of person that has been discriminated against or disadvantaged, and essentially changing our conduct or the way that we use language as not to offend them. I mean, essentially it's a movement towards not offending people. And it seems like that most people, at least most people that I know, quit complaining about that a long time ago because they realize that it makes them sound bigoted, which I think it does. Now, I think that when he's talking about political correctness here, I'm guessing that he's talking more about homosexuality and same-sex marriage and equality for LGBTQ people. But I mean, I don't know about you guys. To my ears, whenever somebody says political correctness, I perk right up and think racism. I'm not saying that I think that's the case here, but that just seemed like such a strange phrase, a strange thing to be complaining about, that people have made a graven image out of being sensitive to disadvantaged people. I mean, what in the hell is that?
I think you've been away from Utah too long, Matthew, because it's still, there's still people, a lot of my coworkers and stuff will say, oh, it's just being too politically correct. And why can't I speak what I believe and have to worry about what other people think? And I think that, Elder Oaks goes on to talk about how we as Mormons believe that sex should only be between a man and a woman, and that marriage should only be between a man and a woman. And those who are politically correct are telling us that we're wrong.
Yeah, exactly. So let me jump into another part of this here, because this is an issue that I have been frequently told is not, or this sort of set of beliefs is something I hear all the time is not really the doctrine of the church, and that they don't actually teach that and they don't actually encourage that. And that's all of this stuff about families. So he goes into saying, we have a unique perspective on the family. We believe in heavenly parents. We believe that exaltation only happens between, or can only happen with, a married man and woman. And for that reason, essentially hetero marriage is the only appropriate setting for children to be born. Sorry, all you gay people who have kids. But then he goes in and talks about that they're grieved at the declining birth rates in Christian nations, and that threatens the survival of cultures and nations. I mean, I don't want to be too reductionist about this, but that sounds very much like, listen, white middle class people, you need to get busy having more children, because if all of these, people of color who are continuing to have good birth rates, so he can't be talking about them. He's certainly not talking about Latinos. I don't think he's talking about blacks. Maybe he is. They don't have declining birth rates, but all of us white people who are affluent, if we don't continue to have kids, civilization is going to fall. Our culture is not going to survive, and nations won't, and perhaps our nation won't survive. I thought that was like very nationalistic, if not a little bit racist. And then he jumps into this thing about, isn't it sad people getting married in their 20s is happening at the lowest rate ever, and that the median ages are higher than ever, and that the nuclear family has become the exception. And he says the real problems here are that the nuclear family is the exception, the choice of career for women is increasing, and the role of father is decreasing. I've said many times to people, one of the teachings that I think is harmful, in the church, one of the reasons I don't expose my children to it, is that they encourage people to get married very, very young. They encourage them to have as many children as they possibly can, very, very young. And they're very much against women having careers. And I always get the response of, oh, but sister such and such in my ward has a job, and, this sister is influential, and et cetera, et cetera. And, the church doesn't truly teach that. Square that up with what Oakes just said. I think he's pretty clearly going on the record with the problems with family and in society are that we're not doing those things. Chris, it seems like you were trying to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, you have a lot there that needs to be unpacked. So at first, I want to address the idea that perhaps he was speaking in kind of a nationalistic light, particularly for Western nations. And I suppose that could be a reading, but I think it was more of the idea that should people choose not to have as many kids, there will be more older people than younger people, and the younger people won't be able to support the older people, and that sort of thing. Japan is actually kind of running into this problem right now, where because people are having fewer and fewer kids, they're having a really aging population, and it's going to be harder for the younger population to take care of them. So I think it was more along that lines rather than just that Western societies are having fewer kids and non-Western societies are having greater kids.
Well, I think that's a fair inference, Chris. But what do you make of him saying that cultures and nations that the survival of cultures and nations depends on it?
Well, it's just like with Japan. If the birth rate, if the young people cannot support the older people, then what's going to happen? And are they going to bring in new people to take care of them, or will the whole country collapse? I think that sometimes people who go down the slippery slope think in those sort of terms.
See, because my thinking is, particularly in the United States, and let's not kid ourselves that the Mormon Church is anything other than a North American, mostly United States church, is that the demographics already show that this country, you fast forward 50 years, going to be a lot more Latinos than there used to be. The white people are going to maybe for the first time be a minority. And I guess that's why we don't need to belabor it anymore, but I guess that's where I'm seeing, sort of the loss of our culture happens essentially as white people stop reproducing. Anyway, go on.
Yeah, I think that's probably a valid way to do it. I'm just not sure a valid way to read it, but I don't think that's what he was going for. But yeah, the other thing that I wanted to unpack from there was the idea about marriage. And you're totally right in that he was saying that it seemed like he was lamenting the fact that people are getting married older and older, and that the marriage rates are dropping. But I've read studies where although the marriage rates are dropping, the divorce rates are dropping even faster. And one of the main reasons they are is because people are getting married older. And they show that the older you get married, if you're above 25 when you get married, your likelihood of getting a divorce drops dramatically.
Yeah, that's such a great point, that the data simply does not support the argument that that's a problem. I saw something not that long ago that talked about, in fact, you always hear the old saw that half of marriages fail, but when you look at first marriages, those are succeeding at a higher rate than they ever have. And just as you say, divorce is way down. Mm-hmm. There's certainly a correlation. There's a correlation between what you're describing with the higher ages. I don't know what else the cause is if not that.
Yeah, it's the higher ages, and in the reports that I read, was college education also helps to contribute to the decrease in divorces. The 50% statistic peaked at like 1970 and then has been dropping ever since. So yeah, the data does not bear out what he's claiming.
But I think if you took a look at essentially his main talking points, I think if you took those talking points and just wrote them down, and then just took a look at a list of perhaps some of your mainstream conservative talking points, maybe a Sean Hannity or a Glenn Beck. These talking points are exactly the same ones. The American society is in decline. White Europe is in decline. And why is it in decline? Because we're getting married older, we're having fewer children than non-whites, we're having children out of wedlock, we're not supporting the role of men in families, and we don't support traditional marriage anymore. And I think it really illustrates not necessarily what the church maybe says, but maybe what white, conservative, Utah LDS people are consuming as far as their social media.
I could see that for sure.
Then he also goes into some thoughts on sex, essentially, and that only being appropriate between married heterosexuals. Well, he says that, we should be compassionate towards all people. We respect the beliefs of all, and even throws a little bone to atheists and says even those with no beliefs, but then says, well, but we ask for similar respect, and, we believe there's an eternal standard that sex is only for married heterosexuals. All other uses of that procreative power are sinful somehow. And that commitment to chastity explains where we are on marriage. And that's where he says that, we're distressed that there are children that are born out of marriage or out of wedlock. Cohabitation has been the norm. And all this pressure for policy change has led to problems such as same-sex marriage already being authorized. And then he says, and I'd be curious to know what you guys thought he may have been talking about. He says, and there are other, that there is pressure for other things or other policy changes that would confuse gender or homogenize men and women. I just got done doing the ERA podcast with Clay, and that sounds exactly like the argument that they were making back in the mid to late 1970s, that the ERA was just going to eliminate all gender distinctions. What did you think he was talking about there?
I think you touched on it. I think it was just bringing up the old ERA issues and all of this scare tactics that were surrounding that.
And Matthew, I think this last third of this talk was essentially giving religious cover to the faithful LDS community that's coming under fire from their non-LDS or less conservative LDS, as far as like affirmation or some of these other LDS communities. And what he's essentially saying is that there is no allowance to condone same-sex marriage in God's plan. And, I don't know how you wake up tomorrow morning as someone who's LDS, but you still support your son or daughter's ability to have a loving relationship if they are in the LGBTQ community. And you wake up and say, someday my LDS faith will embrace this, or I can embrace this and still say that I support the church leadership, because you cannot with as strong comments as he made today.
Yeah, I totally agree. How do you answer your own question? I mean, how do you think they do deal with that, or what do you think the impact of that is?
So here's the issue for me is Dallin Oaks is not a nobody. This would be different if this was some little old lady, first presidency of the Relief Society or something. But, Dallin Oaks is not going away anytime soon. I think you really have to ask yourself, like you've said, this is going to be a talk that's a milestone. And 20 years from now, the church is going to be walking back from this talk saying exactly what they said with the whole bot controversy over African Americans in the priesthood. They're going to basically say, well, I don't know why Dallin Oaks made these comments. That was never church doctrine. Gosh, we don't know why the Lord did that, but that's not what we do now. And I just don't know if for a young teenager or someone in their 20s, if you can look that child in the face and say, you know what, you're just going to have to wait 20 years till the church finally comes into the 21st century. It's tough. It was really made to cover those people that still have those ideas that most people on the outside would consider very bigoted. Yeah, I think they're going to regret it later.
I think that's possible. I mean, it was a sort of a very divisive tone to strike, right? I mean, he talks about how, in seeming to acknowledge that there is increasing recognition for the humanity and normality of LGBTQ relationships, that there are increasing protections and laws that recognize that. And he says, don't make any mistake, just because society is accepting it or the law makes it moral. And he compares it to adultery and fornication and said, just because those things are legal doesn't make them moral. And just as you say, essentially says, if you don't agree with me on this, if you are in support of these things, then you're violating these first two commandments. You're worshiping a graven image. And to let the audience in a little bit, we had a technical glitch here where we paused and Brant was on for just a second. He's helping to record. This was something that deeply affected him. Troy, who's also on Mormon Expositor, I chatted with briefly today. This really affecting him. Another friend of mine, Mac, that I spoke today, this is really affecting them. And it actually kind of caught me by surprise, because I think that for most of us that are out of the church or have been out a while, we kind of look at comments like this and we say, same old church. I mean, this is what they've always said. What's so exceptional here? And I've asked that question, and what I seem to be hearing back from people is, well, particularly on the heels of Uchtdorf's comments yesterday, that seem to be such a different approach, that are so much more inclusive, and there's a place for you, there's a place for everyone. We want to accept everybody. I'm putting words in his mouth, but that's kind of what I think of as this pastoral approach. You've got the approach of an Oakes who feels like, my job is to be a bulwark against this social and ideological and doctrinal change, and I'm going to draw some lines here. And you can see that there are these people who are still in the church who just really desperately want to be able to have their consciences be clean kind of on both ends. They want to be in the church, be faithful members, but at the same time, I think that their consciences tell them, if two people love one another, they're human beings. They have the same desires I do. It's normal for them to want that. It's normal for them to want companionship. It's normal for them to want a family. I think that these are things that a lot of members are kind of coming to in their hearts, and they're really hoping and are encouraged by the words of somebody like Uchtdorf, who seems to be saying, hey, there's a place for you. But then you have somebody like Oakes saying, no, we're going to draw a real bright line here, and if you're on the wrong side of it, then you are in error and you are in sin. And like I say, I was sort of caught off guard today by how genuinely hurtful that is to people who are trying to reconcile it. And I think it goes back, Chris, to what you said earlier, that there are going to be a lot of people who are going to say, you know what, if that's where the line is, then in my heart, I'm on the other side. I'm on the side of the line that shows compassion for other human beings. I'm on the side of the line that understands that they want all the same things that I want. I'm not going to stand with an organization or a system of beliefs that says, no, that's contrary to God's plan.
Yeah, and I think that's totally right. And in a way, I completely agree with everything that Oakes has said in this talk. Basically, what he's saying is that the church cannot and will not change. And that's one of the reasons why I left the church.
Irony alert, though, by the way.
But it's because, what happens is that someone finds an aspect of reality that contradicts the church's teachings. And then they try to find some sort of compromise. The first thing, that they do is doubt their doubts. And then they try to figure out, hey, how can this maybe work together? Maybe this will happen. Maybe the prophets will change their mind. And then here comes Elder Oakes and says, no, there is no compromise. There will never be a compromise. And statements like this force people to choose between the reality that they've seen and the teachings of the church, and who can honestly choose to go against reality.
Yeah, I'm glad you threw in the word compromise. He didn't get all of the quote, but he quoted a talk from President Monson that it seemed like it was maybe 20 or 25 years old, where he said, courage, not compromise, brings the smile of God's approval. A coward is someone who doesn't do what is right because he fears others will laugh. So those of you that in some
and
ways...
right before that was, let us have the courage to defy the consensus.
There you go. So all of you, who support gay rights, who are in the great and spacious building, have fun there. You're worried too much about what other people think. I mean, to me, I look at it from the completely opposite perspective. And when he talks about having the courage to stand up against the crowd, I mean, how many Mormons really, put it this way, for how many of them is the crowd in their life anyone other than other Mormons, right? I mean, even people who don't live in the Mordor, as Jonee called it earlier, they still have surrounded themselves mostly with Mormons. So the crowd in their lives, the jeering crowd, the laughing crowd, is other Mormons. It isn't their coworkers. I don't think anybody at work has given anyone a hard time over this issue. It's not their out of the church friends. I think that the courage people ought to have is to stand up against their friends, to stand up against the members of their own community. I think that's what takes real guts, not sort of, imagining that it is courageous to, take the stand the expense of other human beings, when everybody in your community is just going to pat you on the back for it.
Well, and where does the church think this is going to get them at this point? It's not like they're winning any more political battles with this. Nobody's voting constitutional amendments to protect a man and a woman into their constitutions anymore. No states here in the United States, which of course we realize this religion is very U.S. centric. And not only that, but for all they tout their 15 million members, even if they were all concentrated in the United States, could not affect the swell of support that is seemingly available for same-sex marriage, especially if you take a look at this in 15 years. It seems to me that Oaks just stood up and spit into the wind of political change. As far as I can tell, I cannot see anything that the LDS Church has on the horizon that they would be able to affect change in this situation.
Well, and take it even to more of a micro level and ask, what does this really do? Yeah, clearly I don't think it affects things outside the church, but how is this going to land inside the church, right? So, I mean, do the people in the church who already believe this really need a pat on the back? Do they really need to have it reinforced that this is something that it's acceptable to believe within Mormonism? No, I mean, I think that who this lands on and who it's going to have the greatest effect on are all of the people that are struggling with it, all the people who think of themselves as marginal or progressive, or who are even, just consider themselves orthodox, but are challenged by this issue. So what's the net effect of that? What does that accomplish within the church? I mean, just make some of those people feel guilty and then alienate a whole lot of them? Doesn't seem like a very wise tactical move. Chris, I'm sorry, I kind of stepped on you. What were you going to say?
Yeah, no, that's okay. I think that that's exactly what Oaks is going for. It's not about politics. It's not about tactics. To him, this is the way it is. These are God's laws. There is no compromise in them. And it doesn't matter if everyone is against us. We must stand for what God's laws say they are. And there can be no compromise.
Yeah, and he seems to not have an ounce of self-consciousness when he says that the church cannot change its policies or doctrines. Really?
Yeah,
I mean, it seems like that. Yeah, I mean, that has happened in large and small ways and continues to happen in large and small ways. I mean, there's no reading of history that is compatible with that position. And even from a faithful perspective, I mean, isn't one of the real selling points or things that members feel good about is that they have access to God and continuing revelation, and that God can provide the most current revelation for the times and lead his people and lead the church? I mean, they believe that, but at the same time, here's this argument that the canon is closed. Well, no, God can't change. God doesn't change. Well, the God of Mormonism does. He does all. I mean, plenty of history to support the idea. Go ahead, Jonee.
I just cannot see how he managed to get this talk past PR. I just don't know who did not read this talk before he did this.
Let's jump ahead a little bit. The first words out of Thomas S. Monson's mouth is, I'm going to go home and write in my journal that this has been one of the most inspiring sessions. Everything has been of the most spiritual nature.
After I used this entire conference talk to thank everybody for their lovely gifts for my wife's passing. So yeah, it seems so weird to me that he would push how inspiring and how inspired these talks were after Oaks comes through with that barn burner.
Right. And yeah, so I mean, whether he had planned to say that or whether that was off the cuff or whatever, it certainly puts his imprimatur of authority on it. It certainly stamps it as, yep, I agree. Amen. I feel like I need to take a nap now. That just wore me out talking about Dallin Oaks. Before we move on from Oaks, anything else that we want to say about that?
Well, it's again reemphasized that in this talk, there was verbiage to the effect of, let us have courage to defy the consensus. Let us stay strong and endure and not be moved in our convictions, which again is a repeating theme throughout this session.
I'll just stand on my soapbox for a second and say if anyone is listening to this who has even any ounce of empathy or feeling or sympathy for gay loved ones that they have or people in their lives and, want them to be accepted and want them to have normal lives, free from this sort of thing, give some thought to standing up to the people in your life that you're afraid of to share that with. Give some thought to standing up to your friends and your family. There's a great Martin Luther King quote that says that in the end, we will not remember so much the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. It's just something to think about.
One more thing. I would also like to invite all those who are questioning to embrace reality and, accept that there is no God, and your life will be so much better. You won't have to worry about these conflicts. You won't have to worry about how to love your gay and lesbian relatives and friends and still follows God's law when God doesn't exist. And life is so much sweeter and more fulfilling when that happens.
The views expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinion of the Mormon Expositor podcast, its principals or affiliates.
You're welcome to cut that out later if you'd like.
I'm just giving you bad time. So I'd said to you guys that I was going to jump over Bonnie Oscarson and stick with the apostles, and now I'm just feeling like a really hypocritical misogynist if I do that. So let's just take these in order. Sister Oscarson. Chris, do you want to summarize that one?
I'd be happy to. It's pretty simple. Youth of the church, you must be converted. You become converted by living the principles of the gospel before receiving a confirmation of them. You are responsible for your own conversion.
And you have to keep living all of those gospel principles until you get a conversion,
yes.
Which I thought was very, very important in here. Though after Oakes's talk, I'm not sure there is anybody that was 30 or under that was still listening.
Yeah, that may be true.
That's a good point.
At the risk of focusing on the wrong thing with her, and this is just a general comment, I would love to see one of these women who is a head of one of these auxiliary organizations step to the podium and look like all of the business women that I know, like actually wearing a dark suit and looking like somebody who sits in a boardroom rather than looking like an Easter egg of some shade. I mean, I don't know. It feels like there's kind of a sort of this message of submissiveness is maybe I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into it.
Well, I will give this for her. She didn't have the sing-songy primary voice.
She didn't, although she did talk about having knowledge, which is, I wrote that down because that's a very Utah way to say things. But no, I mean, I didn't really have too much difficulty with this talk. I mean, I think it's a very straightforward statement of Mormon belief that you have to act on the things that are taught before you're going to gain a testimony of them. And she gave the example of herself that, hey, I was a child of the 60s, and that was a time when a lot of people were caught up in immorality and sort of just disregarding any kind of morality at all. And I don't wish that I had been part of that. I mean, and I do think that is sometimes a valid critique of people that are on our side of it, is there is always that, I guess, possibility that, hedonism can follow, that you can throw everything out the window and that, marriages and families and all those things fall apart. And I used to be somebody that said, well, that doesn't ever happen. It does. It happens sometimes. Not saying it happens the majority of the time. So, I took that to heart and said, yeah, I mean, it's important to have morals or values of some kind. Can't be so open-minded your brain falls out, as they say. But I don't think the church is the only way to do that, certainly.
There was a funny tweet during this talk. It said, say no to drinking and drugs, even if you don't get a date. In the end, your friends are stoned, but you are the young women president.
Hey, it works. Jonee?
I just wanted to touch briefly on Isabel Hogan, who she talked about and who was her great-great-great-grandmother, I believe, where she indicated that this young woman had taken a position with a non-LDS household there in Utah, and where she was one of 8 children, obviously coming from an extremely poor background. And if you knew Utah back then, because Brigham Young was keeping Utah so isolated, Utah in and of itself was also extremely poverty-stricken. The fact that she was championing the fact that Isabel's mother was so proud of the fact that she had kept her child back from all of these opportunities for a better life, just so that she could keep her daughter in Utah, essentially looking at the possibility of becoming somebody's polygamous wife at that point in time and having some huge number of children and a life of drudgery, providing for her children while her husband has maybe 3-4 other wives, was better than the possibility of getting an education and marrying well and living a life of betterment with this other family. Really struck me as really unfortunate.
High five to Grandma for having done that.
Yeah, and I realize that this is Bonnie's forebearer, but I wonder where Bonnie would be now if Isabel had just run away and gone with that family. I wonder if Bonnie would live on the East Coast and be someone of real renown. It was just a really sad example of how the church is happy to allow their families to just kind of wallow in poverty as long as they stay Mormon.
Yeah, because especially if you're a woman, it's not particularly important that you attain anything beyond being a homemaker and nurturer.
And have children. Yeah.
Right. All right. Let's move on to Elder Maines. I might have fallen asleep during this one. Does anyone remember what he said?
Sure, I'll give a quick summary.
Go ahead.
We need to get into spiritual shape. When our testimony is strong, we make good choices. When our testimony is weak, we make poor choices. Become the rock that the river cannot wash away.
Okay.
You know, and the number one thing that he wanted to talk about, and I thought this was really sad, is sometimes we wake up in the morning and we have challenges that we can overcome, and then others of us have challenges that we will never overcome until the resurrection, and we are expected to endure to the end. For me, that really spoke to the ordained women movement as well as the LGBTQ community. And
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I don't think he's talking about physical handicaps or disease or your spouse passes away. No, I think you're absolutely right. And again, it's the reason why there just aren't that many gay Mormons. Most people find at some point that they have a need to actually be happy in this life and that they can't just endure to the end. And I think if most people are being honest, then they would have to acknowledge that they wouldn't accept that for themselves. Or at least I think that if they were in that situation, they wouldn't accept it for themselves. So, Richard G. Scott.
I can summarize it if you like.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. The atonement is pretty awesome. The people of Ammon covenanted never to fight again. When they were needed, they said, wait, we don't have to reevaluate promises that we made in light of changing circumstances. We can just let our children fight for us. We all need the atonement. So repent, and repent often. Did anyone catch how he connected the story of the people of Ammon with the atonement?
No, and in fact, I wrote at the end of that story, somehow this has something to do with the atonement. I didn't quite catch how he connected. Did you think it did?
I didn't quite catch it. I'm sure there was some kind of link somewhere, but I think I blinked and missed it. There were things like, you know, in the war, they had to fortify the weak areas, and personal strength comes from the atonement. And so here's an example of personal strength or something like that.
Well, I think if you look at this from a porn perspective, it'll all come clear.
Do you know we made it 50 minutes before there was a mention of porn? That must be some record, but yeah. Well, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so he says Jesus Christ's atonement, he always sees weakness with mercy. He sees rebellion with punishment. And he says Satan exploits your spiritual vulnerabilities through your past sins. You know, essentially, he was really pushing the fact that once you've allowed sin to catch hold into your spirit, you always have a satanic vulnerability. And, you know, I can just see this go hand in hand with the church's concept of porn, where once you look at porn once, you'll never be able to not look at it again. You're constantly, you can say whether that's normal or not, but you're constantly be tempted to see porn again. So one of the things that he was really focusing on is just like sons of Helaman's fathers who had allowed themselves to become slaves to their carnality during their violence, and they could never pick up arms again because they would just become these carnal, savage, horrid beasts. If you allow yourself to fall back ever into this sin ever again, think of porn there, then you will become this savage, horrible beast because Satan has this one area that you're really vulnerable where he can latch back onto you.
Yeah, and I thought, what a strange example this story gives of that, because you can't even do that even if it means that your children are going to die. I mean, this was kind of felt like an emperor has no clothes moment for me, because here just for anybody that doesn't remember the story, he's talking about how Ammon converts the Lamanites, and they bury their weapons and they covenant with God that they're never going to use them again. And, you know, at some point some of them die because they won't do that, which, you know, okay, understandable. But then they join up with the Nephites. The Nephites protect them, but at some point the Nephites begin to wear down. They don't have the resources anymore, and they're back in conflict. And so these Ammonites he couches it this way, have this really stark choice of, okay, are we going to protect our families? Because the duty we all know that the duty of a man is to be a protector. The duty of fathers is to protect their children. Or are we going to break a covenant? And he says, but it's never justified to break a covenant. I mean, let's assume that this is all true. I mean, that they really can't break a covenant and that they're really going to pay the consequences if they do. I can see morally and ethically saying, rather than break my ethics and break my promise, I'm going to die. It's a different ethical thing to say, rather than suffer the consequences of my decision if I break my covenants, I'm going to let my children die. And I thought, what kind of people were these? If people are literally coming to kill my children or coming to kill my family, I think that I'm probably going to suffer whatever consequence, short-term or eternal, that I have to prevent that from happening, rather than to say, sorry, guys, sorry, spouse, sorry, kids, I'd love to keep you from getting killed, but, hey, my eternal soul's on the line. I mean, does that strike anybody else as like really selfish?
Totally. I think that another thing that is tricky about that is that for me, I don't think there is any shame in reevaluating promises that you made in the light of new information. And a lot of times ex-Mormons will be given a hard time by saying, oh, well, you've made covenants in the temple and now you're a covenant breaker. And so I guess your word doesn't mean anything. And I think that being able to reevaluate based on the circumstances and in the light of new knowledge is actually a positive thing.
Yeah. So I'm just looking over my notes to see if there's anything else I wanted to mention.
No, I think throwing your children under the bus was essentially the horrifying end to this talk.
Right. Well, and I guess I'll just add that, again, on this issue of that there are some things for which there are lifelong consequences, that there's some things that are going to taint you forever, that you're never going to get over. I just don't think that has to be true most of the time. I mean, clearly, yes, it's true sometimes. If I make a bad decision out driving one day and I permanently injure myself in an accident, well, yeah, I'm going to live with that. But the idea that you're going to self-impose some kind of problem, or limitation on yourself as a consequence of some past thing, that just, I don't know, that doesn't make any sense to me. I think someone said in one of the Facebook groups that they're a lot more interested in living than enduring to the end. So let's wrap up with President Monson here. And I'll just say that I thought, notwithstanding what we said before about him kind of putting his stamp of approval on what Elder Oaks said, the first part of the talk I kind of liked and even felt, slightly moved by, when he talked about his spouse. I mean, there's so many times when I've listened to Thomas Monson and, one of the stories of his widows or one of the, million people that he ministered to and thought, is he making this up or it just didn't seem like there was anything real in it. It was, for me, nice and sad in a way that I'll mention in a minute. I mean, it was nice to sort of see him standing up there, having experienced, I think, some real anguish and, talking about the loss of his spouse and how there just weren't any words for it. And, to be really speaking from the heart there, I kind of felt that. And then he talks, and this is the part that made me feel sad, is then he says, she always supported me all the times I had to be away, all the times I wasn't with my kids, all the times that she had to pick up my slack. She made all of these sacrifices for me. And I thought, I wonder if he ever made any sacrifices for her. I wonder if he ever, this person that he values so much, whether it ever occurred to him to miss a meeting for the benefit of his wife or for the benefit of his kids, or whether he ever decided not to take a trip, or, whether in a way he's not just also a victim of kind of the same thinking that everybody is, that no, if I do what I'm supposed to in my, church responsibilities and my callings, that ultimately it's going to be made up to me somehow. And it's just made me feel sad because he's there acknowledging, I think, all the stuff that he missed. And I don't know how that gets made up to them. Certainly it's been made up to him in some ways by the, the prestige and all of the other, kudos and good feelings that come with being the president of the church. But anyway, so that part I like. But what did other people think?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to talk bad about a talk in which someone just expresses how much he misses his wife. They've passed away. It's a sad thing.
Yeah, and I wondered how much of this was personal for him, because he offers the example of Job, and he talks about that sometimes we ask, why me, and it seems like there's no hope, or we feel heartbroken or abandoned, and then he moves on to, do I falter, and change who I am, or do I finish and endure? And he says, I would rather endure. It's important to endure under those circumstances, which I guess if you're him, if you're someone that's given 80 plus years to it, then yeah, probably best not to change now. He also talked about, and then there was, I'll just throw another thing in here that I liked, that I very much agreed with, is that he said that challenges give us the opportunity to change for the better. They allow us to become more, I think he used the word more empathetic and more understanding than we were. And I very much agree with that. I mean, in fact, one of the turning points of, I think, of my journey away from the church and sort of having my bubble smashed was experiencing some real adversity as a missionary and experiencing some real pain and experiencing some real problems that I didn't have any control of and couldn't get out of. And sort of from that point forward in life, thinking like, wow, maybe people are not always to blame for the problems that they have. So I like what he's saying there. I think that there is an opportunity through adversity to become more empathetic. It's maybe the best thing that can come out of it, in my opinion. So I liked that. I think where I, of course, differ with him is that he says that, the only way that we get through that adversity, or the only way that we make that growth, is through Jesus or through the church. And I'll just say that my experience is that you can do it with or without.
Agreed.
I just wanted to pull out two things that were probably unrelated to the theme of his talk, but which I felt were really kind of spoke to me. Number one, I noticed that he did use a term that we hardly ever hear anymore, and that is that we are in the dispensation of the fullness of times. I think ever since Packer's talk a year ago, where he said that we're not in the absolute last days, that many of us here will probably see our children, if not our grandchildren, grown before Jesus comes. I think they've really been trying to downplay the apocalyptic nature of Mormonism. But I thought it was really interesting that he used that term. And then
did that seem?
Sorry?
I just want to interrupt you to ask you. Did
Sure.
that seem calculated to you, or did that seem more like just one of those kind of Mormon-y phrases that just gets used sometimes, and he threw it in there for effect?
For me personally, I got the idea that it was just something that he uses, and he's used so often he doesn't even think of the relevance of it anymore. Where I think they've actively been trying to purge that out of talks. I don't necessarily know that he wrote that in to be telling as much as it just came from the heart. That's a personal opinion.
So what was the second thing?
The other thing is that he actually touched on a real keystone of the Mormon religion that I thought was really important. And he referenced Matthew 16:19, where he indicates what can be bound on earth is also bound in heaven. I just really wanted to touch on this as one of those key things in Mormonism, that Mormons really feel like they understand the scripture, because they use this as the justification for the priesthood being able to bind families together and to seal families in an eternal progression. And what's bound on earth, meaning all of our sealing work and all the temple work that we do, is actually bound in heaven. But in reality, if Joseph Smith and also the early church leaders had a better understanding of the Bible and rabbinical use of those terms, they would have understood that in the Jewish culture of the first century, typically what bind and loose was meant by Jewish rabbis was essentially where Jewish rabbis would decide what was okay and not okay for the faithful to do in certain types of laws. So there's quite a bit of discussion about this in a variety of different biblical scholars. I would actually refer you to people like Robert M. Price or A.T. Robertson, neither of which are LDS, but more importantly, they're extensive biblical scholars. And essentially, to bind in rabbinical language is to forbid, or loose is to permit, which in actuality is exactly the opposite of how Mormons use those terms. We would never say, well, my marriage was bound in heaven, meaning it was forbidden, right? And we would never say, oh, my marriage was loosed on earth, and so it was permitted. And I find it really interesting that every once in a while I'll see these nuggets of the old Mormon cultural misunderstanding of the Bible. And it really illustrates the fact that Joseph Smith was doing his gosh darn best to bring in a loving and supportive community and do what was working for him. But he really didn't have a good understanding of the underlying text that he was working with.
Right. I mean, nobody did then, right? I mean, exegesis, the Bible didn't really start happening until like half a century later. No, but that's really fascinating. One last thing that I wanted to mention: are you guys aware of this? And my apologies to this person because I know his name and I just can't come up with it. Somebody has written a paper about how Thomas Monson has not testified as to anything respecting the Restoration or specifically to the church. And what did he say? Something like 5 years or 6 years or something like that. And I will tell you. Sorry, Jonee, go ahead.
I actually had Ryan Boquet at my home.
That's his. I'm sorry. Say his name again.
His name is Ryan Boquet.
Right. Okay, go on.
And he was at my home actually 2 weeks ago, and we were talking about this very subject. And it's actually significantly longer than that. He's gone back, I believe, the last 8 years and discussed Monson's, and he actually names it Monson's failure to testify. He's actually going to be coming out with another one on research on Packer's unwillingness to forcibly testify on the Book of Mormon as well. But anyway, I'll let you get back to your comments there, Matthew.
I'm glad that you supplemented what I was saying there. I was just going to say, and I mean, and certainly no disrespect to him, I'm very skeptical of that hypothesis. I'm probably as willing as anyone to be persuaded, because for those who haven't followed it, the underlying thing is that he doesn't really have a testimony of the Restoration and that he sort of codedly talks around it. And I'd just be really surprised if that were true. That having been said, I think I can say that there's nothing in this talk, there's no evidence I see in this talk that undermines that hypothesis. Do either of you see any?
I didn't notice any.
I mean, I think it's pretty much typical Thomas Monson relationship with God, relationship with Jesus that could, most of it probably come out of Joel Osteen's mouth.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if that's not because the church is trying to Protestantize themselves, make themselves more palatable to the general Christian community.
Some of them are anyway.
Certainly. Well, except for Dallin Oaks. But
right.
Anyway, but yeah, I was actually specifically listening for this just because Ryan's a good family friend, and I certainly didn't hear it in this particular talk.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to comment on, and then we probably need to make some final comments and wrap up, because I can't remember if I said this on air or off air, but kind of one of the big picture things that I'm seeing coming out of this conference is, what did you call me earlier on, Jonee? Was it an Uchtdorfer?
Yep, you're an Uchtdorfer.
Yeah, tell everybody why I'm an Uchtdorfer.
Well, so my husband and I were talking this afternoon, and we really see two types of Mormons emerging. There's kind of what people used to call like a liberal Mormon or an East Coast Mormon. It used to kind of be a hiss and a byword. If you were professed to be a Mormon, in contrast to a Jack Mormon, you'd be what's called an East Coast Mormon or a liberal Mormon. But I think more and more they're becoming Uchtdorf Mormons, where there's kind of this touchy-feely, big tent, Democrat style. There's room for everybody. Just come and be loved, and we love you, and please love us. And then there's more of the Bednars and the Packers and the Oaks of, if you're going to be a Mormon, you're going to stand for something, and you're going to stand for old-time values. And we really don't care who we offend by that. And I think you see more and more the Mormon corridor, which I like to call the Morador, becoming more and more kind of a fundy light, where everybody focuses on that they have very high standards for morality, who can over modesty themselves and their children more, who can follow the most rules, and who cannot compromise. And I think that's what we heard today was Uchtdorf and his big tent mentality, and Oaks and his no compromise. If you compromise, it's moral cowardice mentality.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, isn't it? Because, I mean, I don't think that it's possible that Uchtdorf and Oaks are singing out of the same book, let alone off of the same page. I mean, there seems to be a real difference there. I don't think it's easy to look at that and say, oh, there's some way to harmonize it. The brethren are in accord on that. I mean, I think back to, I became most aware of it when I read Greg Prince's book about the life of David O. McKay. But you've sort of got the guys like David O. McKay and Hubie Brown and some others that are more, I don't know if liberal's the right word, but they're certainly more open. And, you don't have to have a belief again. It's okay to believe in evolution. It's okay to believe in this. David O. McKay's famous conversation with Sterling McMurrin, we're more open, we're more accepting, and then on the other hand, you had sort of these really conservative doctrinaire guys like Joseph Fielding Smith, who wrote, Man is Origin and Destiny, flatly condemning a belief in evolution as being completely inconsistent with the gospel. Bruce McConkie was an example, going back a little further, Mark Peterson. And I think a lot of people, including me, had sort of thought, well, Boyd Packard is kind of an entertaining old guy, but he's the last of his kind. He's a dying breed. He's kind of out of that Joseph F. Smith, Bruce McConkie mold, but, there's really nothing like that anymore. But I'm not so sure I can say that anymore. I think you're right. I think that there is a real difference between the Oaks and the Bednars and some of the others and Uchtdorf. I mean, I said to somebody today, how long is it going to be before saying I'm an Uchtdorf Mormon is a thing? I mean, he's wildly popular, and I think that there is precedent in the church, and it's certainly true in other organizational structures, that having a popular following can translate into real power. I'd sort of just wonder, and I don't truly have an idea, but I wonder if a point comes where Uchtdorf is the president of the church, whether he has it in him to be a Pope Francis or in some ways a David O. McKay to be a true reformer, or if he's just kind of a more polished version of what everybody else is. I don't truly know, but it's interesting to watch, because I don't think that it's inevitable that a personality like him finds its way into the top power structure and sort of challenges with the way he approaches things, the way things have been done before, and the way that others are still trying to do it.
Now, I think he definitely exemplifies a group of individuals that were brought in. But I think if you take a look at who is controlling the young adult population, especially as it relates to college-educated, the missionaries, BYU, Idaho, definitely Bednar and his type are definitely doing everything they can to bring up the next generation much like themselves. I think Uchtdorf may have a following, but it may be very difficult for him to take the whole church into a different direction.
Well, for example, Brant is from BYU, Idaho, and he's totally under Bednar's thumb. So he can react to that whenever he listens to it.
That was a cruel comment, Matthew.
Yeah, well, Brant knows I love him. All right, well, unless...
Yeah, I wanted to throw in one more thing.
Please.
What a lot of these talks have been stressing on again and again is endure to the end, be the rock that the river runs around, never give up, never surrender. And I think that it kind of shows that the church is starting to be aware that a lot of its members are questioning things and leaving them. And we had Uchtdorf's talk about doubt your doubts, things like that. And so I think that they're aware of this, and they just want to keep iterating this no matter what happens. Just stick with the church, endure. Things may come along and they may be weird and you may read something on the internet, but just keep with it, keep enduring, because we're what you need to have.
All right. Well, Jonee and Chris, thanks very much for being with us today. Thanks, everyone, for listening. And with that, we will now hand it off to the Sunday afternoon crew.
All right, guys, welcome to Sunday afternoon General Conference Review. Today there is myself, Clay, and we also have Scott. Hello, Scott.
Hello, thank you for having me.
And we have Mike. Hi, Mike.
Hi, nice to be here. I am Mike T, but not that Mike T.
Good call. No, absolutely. So, yeah, great to have you guys on. I think there's plenty of fodder for us to talk about this afternoon. And, for Saturday afternoon, when I hosted, we kind of did a roundtable discussion. We're not going to do a blow-by-blow. We'll take turns kind of throwing out topics that we'd like to talk about and then bounce them around. For those people that do want to know kind of what the layout of the session was, it was President Irene conducting. Then we had a few of the 12. We had Quentin Cook. We also had Neil Anderson. Then we had a guy named David McConkie, Sunday School Presidency, Kevin Hamilton, Adrian Ochoa, Terrence Vinson, and then Russell Nelson, and then Thomas Monson to end. But I guess I'll start with one topic. I'm going to start with one of the things that I saw that could be potentially good, and that was David McConkie. I think he was the first counselor in the Sunday School presidency, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know. I assume he's related to McConkie somehow, but I have no idea. It seemed like he was giving Sunday school teachers a bit of a green light to deviate from the manual. Would you guys agree with that or disagree with that?
Sort of a yes and a no. I know he started out and said, teach the gospel, don't mix it with the philosophies of men. But I really did like his talk in that he said, you should listen to your students. They'll tell you what they need to hear. Don't be so focused on like laser focused on teaching just the manual. So, yeah, it's sort of a yes. But I think he also wanted to emphasize to stick with the manual as well.
Yeah, I think it was a bit of a mixed message, but I do think he did emphasize making sure that you would think about what the Savior would teach at that time, and so utilize that as a guide to what you're teaching. And then I did like too that he said, listen to the students. You'll be able to figure out what they need if you do that, and then of course by being guided by the Spirit, of course, is also critical. But then they can managed to actually teach things that would be helpful to the students, not necessarily sticking to the rote lesson manual and the things that are in there. So I did think that was pretty good.
Yeah, and you guys are both right. I think that by no means did he give teachers free rein to do what they want. And, you said there was a dual message, Scott, and I think that doublespeak was kind of a underlying theme through many of the talks during this session, is they'd say one thing and then they'd say something directly contradicting that thing and kind of bounce off. But that, we can agree that could have potentially good effects on Sunday school for those that still attend. How about you, Scott? What do you, good, bad, or ugly, do you want to bring up?
Well, I was saying earlier that, obviously as an Australian, I was very excited that there was an Australian speaking. So that was very nice. But I did feel like the entire conference was a lot about fear of different things, fear of the internet, fear of women agitating for things, fear of homosexuals agitating for things. There was a lot of fear involved. And one of the things I like to do, and I thought about doing as I came into this as a non-believer, I thought that it would be useful to find things that might be able to speak to me, that actually would have relevance in my life, things that I could, find as value. And so I really watched for that, and watched for those things that make you a good person, not necessarily a good Mormon, but just a good person in general. And I didn't find too many. Most of the conference talks were very, very specific to Mormons. There wasn't a lot of general applicability of any of the talks that we had today, which I thought was kind of strange. One of the things that, especially today, with last night at the priesthood session, there was the ordained women movement that was trying to get into the priesthood session, and I definitely saw a number of talks that seemed like they were directly referencing that. The first talk, which was from Quentin Cook, he talked a lot about avoiding the philosophies of men and avoiding those trends. His talk was a lot about straw men, and one of the big straw men that he pulled out was that feminists are always demeaning women who stay at home and who work at home. And of course that's not true. But feminism is more about choice for women and equality and options. But he specifically spoke about that. He talked about how we need to avoid that, and how if we divorce women and that special bond that they have with children, then we lose something as a society. And so that seemed like it was directly correlated to the ordained women stuff. But then the second talk,
I want to jump in on the Cook talk real quick. I think that
sure.
Yeah. So to give listeners some reference, he was talking about like certain vices that were going to just bring the downfall of your spiritual well-being, and that specifically he said one of those things was the ideology and political beliefs that are against gospel principles. And when Cook goes off about women, it's again one of these doublespeak examples that I think is very poignant. He gets all pulpit poundy and saying, I am not, I appreciate women's influence in every realm, within the world, but, oh, by the way, women should be homemakers type of thing,
Right.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've seen said, during this conference, probably more than any other, I've been following threads on Facebook and Twitter, and I've seen a lot of people say things like, I'm not sure how I feel about the ordained women movement, but one thing that really bothers me is that it seems that the women want to put themselves above the men, that the feminists want to make themselves superior to men. And that's really not what it's about. Like, I suppose that when you've always been in a position of privilege, it's easy to say that somebody who wants to have equality is actually advocating for, for special rights or special privileges. But that's really not what it's about. It's just to have the equal opportunity and the equal ability to partake of what they feel is something that's very special and should be given freely to all people, right? But that's something that's been pretty frustrating to me, and I don't know that anybody specifically in this session said that, but I definitely feel like that's along with like the religious liberty question. For example, people advocating for gay marriage. It's often been said by Elder Oaks in particular, and Quentin Cook sort of was alluding to this near the end of his talk, that people who are advocating for gay marriage really want to have more rights than the ones that have already been given to heterosexual people who marry, and that they want to take away religious liberty in addition to having equality.
Yeah, and I think, no doubt, I think it's this fear mongering, and I think there was a lot said about homosexuality and homosexual rights in this conference session. I think, Scott, you were going to segue. Were you going to talk about Anderson's talk? Because I think that'll give us great fodder to talk about ordained women and maybe some just horrendously poor analogies he threw out in his talk.
Yes, so that was the thing about Quentin Cook's talk, was he did broach the topic of women in the priesthood, but then Neil Anderson ran with it. And he was the second speaker, and he even started with this kind of an analogy which just almost made me sad. I know he was trying to be very positive, but he was talking about a mother who was raising her 5 children, and she was singing that song, I think it's Love at Home, where they talk about, our family is blessed by priesthood power. And, of course, in her situation as a single mum with 5 kids, she doesn't have that in her home available to her. And so, of course, he talked about, how it can be available through home teachers and other ways. But he then led into just continual discussion around women in the priesthood, why they don't have it, talking about how we just basically don't know. We don't know God's mind. We don't know why he has it set up that way. We know that he loves us all equally. We know that gender is eternally important. We know that we have sacred roles that have been assigned for each sex, but we don't know why God set it that way, so basically we just need to accept it. And that was pretty much his discussion. The other thing I thought was kind of funny, though, he did talk about pornography again, which of course is always a perennial favorite. And he did talk about how use of pornography destroys your ability to use the priesthood. And so if you're unworthy, then you should withdraw yourself from all activity with the priesthood. And so my thought immediately was, if men have such a problem with pornography and it's causing so much problems with priesthood power, then maybe we need to give women the priesthood so that they can actually have some worthy members who can use it.
Good
yeah,
question.
Because women don't look at porn. We know. That's
right. Exactly.
At least church leaders don't know that they look at porn, right?
Exactly.
So Mike,
he also had that. So he had that drapes analogy also, right?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you to talk about, that and maybe why it is so just unsatisfying.
Yeah, I had some problems with the kids during this section, but I got the gist that, we don't exactly know why. Like the men happen to be in charge of opening the drapes to let in the warmth and the light of the sun, and we don't know why that is. But the men aren't in charge of the sun. They don't own the sun. The sun being sort of an analogy, or I guess I don't know exactly what the analogy is. I guess the priesthood is the ability to act in the name of God to open the drapes.
Yeah, that's exactly what he was saying. He was saying, well, first he leads in with, I feel like, was an extremely condescending remark that, some people mistake priesthood power with masculinity and men, and that a man can open the curtains, but he doesn't have control over the sun. But which I find just an abhorrent analogy. One, because okay, but does that mean that it's really good that a woman has to call a man over to her house to open up her drapes whenever she wants them opened? It's just weird. But then also this idea that, women who want the priesthood just haven't really thought about it that much. They're just mistaken. They're just mistaken because they think that the priesthood is equivalent with maleness, when really it's not, and this, I just feel like it's condescending to speak to a large body of membership and women who have put a lot of thought into this. Many of these people are still believers, and they've put prayer and they've put, their entire spiritual efforts into understanding this, and just saying, well, but, you're just mistaken. You're confused.
It's interesting that he would say that the priesthood is not synonymous with maleness, when the women who desire the priesthood showed up to what's called the priesthood session. It's not called the men's session, and they weren't let in because they were not men. They let non-Mormon men in. They let men in who are prospective elders, but they wouldn't let the women in, despite the fact that priesthood is not synonymous with maleness. It seems, I mean, it's a little more of the doublespeak to me, I think.
Yeah, and then he goes on to say things that I can neither confirm nor deny, but I thought were just out of place when he talked about President Monson and how he's a long-lasting example of asking and receiving women's input, right?
Yeah, that was fantastic. I loved how President Monson's a perfect example to us of how we should treat women, because he loved his wife and he took care of the widows in his ward, and he did consult with the women's organizations before they changed the age for missionaries. So obviously that's what we should all be doing. Yeah. I did think that was really interesting as well.
I did like, and this may be just I heard a little snippet out of context, and I like that he said that listening sincerely to the thoughts and concerns of women is vital in marriage, in life, and in running the kingdom of God, and that women have many good ideas if they were asked. But then I guess he just sort of went on and said, well, we just don't really ask them very often, except President Monson did that once.
Or we need the invitation of a male in order to then open up ears and listen to them, I mean, there's that example of Holland saying, hey, listen to the Relief Society president. She has a lot to say. It was pointed out to me, isn't it funny that it had to be him to even point the direction towards this, female leader.
But on a positive note, I do think it's actually it's good that they're even talking about that they need to, involve the women in the wards as part of the discussion, that they need to be seeking out their advice, they need to be utilizing them as, as people who actually may have good ideas. And so, if I'm going to give them some positive props, that's one thing. If nothing else, if women can be more involved in some of those decisions and get a little bit more input, that can only be a good thing. Obviously, it's not enough, but we can get there.
Yeah, and I think even the very fact that they did address it openly and in a non-hidden way within a talk is a little bit positive, right? I mean, the church has the option and the power just to not say anything about it. And the fact that Neil Anderson tried to grapple with this within his talk, and you could tell that I think he felt incredibly inadequate to do it because he didn't have any good answers. Nobody has any good answers, and even though he towed the party line, at least he was trying to grapple with it on some level.
Yeah, I do think that it is good that the discussion is happening, because if we just weren't hearing anything at all, then I think it would be clear that movements like the Ordained Women movement would be having no effect whatsoever. And I don't expect that, the LDS Church is going to turn around and start ordaining women next week or next year or in the next 50 years. Who knows how long it might take, but I like that the discussion is happening because once the ideas start to flow, it may be possible that, God could have a revelation. If people are thinking about it, if they are examining their own hearts as far as that's concerned, then things might change.
Well, isn't that the way it's supposed to work anyway? That, they're supposed to, think about it in their own mind and ponder it and think about what the solution should be and then approach the Lord and see if that's the right decision. And so hopefully this is prompting some people to have those kind of discussions and thoughts in their own minds.
Yep, no doubt. All righty, Mike, how about you? Good, bad, ugly? What kind of topics really drew your attention?
Let's see. I think we've hit most of the good already.
Yeah, fair enough.
I did like that Elder Nelson spoke briefly. At the very beginning of his talk, he was talking about how amazing our body is, and that you can use your brain to learn. And I did notice he said, "Look in the mirror and see how amazing your body is," which sounded a little out of place during General Conference, but I was amused anyway. He was going on to say your body's a temple and that we need to treat it. The way that it should be treated. And he and Quentin Cook both touched on the idea that we need to keep ourselves free of, physical addictions and drugs and that sort of thing, which is always, in general, a good principle. But yeah, then Elder Nelson's talk sort of took a real turn for the negative. For the
horrible.
Yes, he did. And he just started hitting all the talking points with, Adam and Eve being our example of marriage and that it should be one man and one woman and our doctrines don't change. And, despite the fact that, sin might be legalized in our secular societies, we can't ever change the doctrines of God because they're not ours to change. And he went with, I think he touched on the ordination of women issue and the homosexuality and and all of the hot button, topics in the last couple of years that have been on everybody's minds.
But not only that, not only did he go off and talk about homosexuality, and just because gay marriage is legal in some states doesn't mean that it's okay. But in my mind, and I could have been reading too much into this, in my mind, he was saying that homosexuals can become heterosexual.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
He spent a lot of time about the misuse of sex and desires, and he said desires can change through prayer and the atonement. It's that easy. And then he goes on to say about gender is essential, and then he immediately follows that up with this homosexual talk, and he's continually saying self-mastery of one's personal desires with kind of a sexual, homosexual undertone. And I thought that was an enormous blow and a tremendous step back for the church. Here, the church is finally, in some cases, admitting that people are born, they like to say homosexual tendencies or same-sex attraction syndrome or whatever they like to say, but they're finally admitting that there is evidence that this is biological. And then you have Russell Nelson say, oh, but with Jesus you can like women,
Yep. And even worse than that, he was basically saying that the only way, which is really a step backwards as well, but the only way to have true happiness is in a heterosexual marriage, which of course throws under the bus all of those poor sisters and brethren who haven't been able to find an eternal companion, or all those other things as well. But from an anti-homosexual perspective, it's just so wrong saying that these people can never experience happiness unless they're in that heterosexual relationship. And like you said, Clay, it feels again like he's talking to these people and saying, you know what, I know you're suffering, but if you only try out this heterosexual marriage, that's when you'll have true happiness.
That's the impression I got. Commenters, let us know if you think that we misinterpreted it, but I thought the message was loud and clear. So
yeah, and even beyond, homosexuality is wrong and you can change. I thought near the end of his talk, he also went on to sort of imply that each of us will be held accountable by Jesus himself for what we did to honor God's pattern in marriage, which to me is sort of a coded message for, you can't be aiding and abetting the people who want to legalize same-sex marriage, because if you do, you're going to have to explain that choice to Jesus. Now, I know that it's been said before, I even heard that President Monson said this, but I don't know for sure, that, members are free to vote their conscience in those types of matters, and the church, doesn't take a political position one way or the other, although it does take positions on issues of morality. But this seemed to me to be an admonition to not only, to resist homosexuality in your own life, but also make sure that you go out and advocate for Jesus' true heterosexuality.
Yeah. So I'll go ahead and take a topic here, and it's going to feed off of what Scott was talking about early about fear-mongering and just, be afraid and things like that. Kevin Hamilton and Adrian Ochoa, both of the 70, gave talks. Kevin Hamilton pretty much gave the impression, hey, if you make any little mistake, Satan's going to get you. You have got to be worried about every tiny little decision, because if you make a slightly wrong decision, you're hosed. And he talks about church attendance. That's pretty typical. But then I thought it was interesting that I thought Ochoa, he really did a shout out and a warning of online material that's critical of the church. He talks about internet is full of bad, it's full of porn, but then it's also full of half-truths. And he essentially gave the message that if you read anything that makes you question your testimony, that thing is not true, which is, a horrible logical fallacy and does not promote critical thinking. And then he started criticizing people that people that are critical of the church are demanding physical evidence. And this is a personal pet peeve of mine, because it's, I've had familial discussions about this as well, where people tell me, oh, you just want evidence and proof of everything. And I say, no, you know what? I actually don't care if people have personal beliefs in things that there is not necessarily hard evidence for. But if there is hard evidence against it, I don't want people to ignore evidence, I don't need evidence, objective evidence of maybe some of the truth claims of the church. But if there's hard evidence against those claims, then, by God, I'm going to pay attention to that evidence. But Thoughts?
No, I agree. I think both of these talks were really about, be afraid and be careful with your decisions. I think Kevin Hamilton even went further than saying, your own salvation could be in danger if you make the wrong decision. He also basically threatened you with the loss of salvation of all of your descendants as well. I mean, he gave the example of his father, who was a 13-year-old deacon, and one afternoon, after their morning churches, because this was back when they had sacrament meeting in the afternoon or the evening, his mother leaned over to his father and asked his father if they should just go for a drive in the country as a family instead of going to sacrament meeting. And of course, they decided to go on the drive instead. And since then, the entire family went inactive, and a number of the family members ended up dying outside of the church. And so, of course, any decision you make can have far-reaching consequences for not only for you but also for your descendants. And just from missing church one day, that's where you're going to end up in a lot of trouble. And I think that's that fear-mongering that's just kind of gets to me so badly when I listen to these talks as a non-believer now. It's just kind of crazy how much they try and scare people into doing the right thing all of the time. And even he even said, he gave out the shout out to those families that don't go to church when they're on vacation. Make sure you're still attending church every single time, every single meeting, so that you can keep all of your descendants safe.
Right. When he was talking about the going for a Sunday drive, it reminded me of a time just when I was first beginning to allow myself to, sort of question things and think for myself as far as what it was that I preferred. And one of the members of the High Council was in a fifth Sunday school. So I was sitting next to my wife, and he got up at the front at the beginning of the meeting, and he said, I really enjoy on a Sunday to go for a drive in the mountains. And he was saying it with a smile on his face, and I was in the back of the room, and I was nodding my head. I was like, yes, finally somebody who gets it. And then he looked at me, and I was nodding my head, and he gave me a frown and a wry look, and he said, and he shook his head, and I was like, oh, you trapped me. Oh, John, what have you done to me? This talk just brought back the memory of that.
He bait and switched you, man.
Yeah. That was a dirty, rotten trick.
I don't know. So we didn't talk about the Aussie too much, though, but Terrence Vinson is his name. I've never heard him before. As an atheist, of course, I didn't agree with the things that he was saying, but I found his talk entirely unoffensive, and that he was saying that, hey, Heavenly Father loves you, he's watching out for you, rely on him, keep him close, and things like that. I think the Aussie brought it from down under and probably won the day, but...
Yeah, I agree. It wasn't too offensive. I did think he used an analogy at the beginning, which I thought was kind of funny from my perspective anyway, which was he talked about how his grandchild was trying to open a door lock or something like this. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, but that, of course, he, as the grandfather, could open this door lock all the time, but the grandchild couldn't open it all the time. And then the grandchild managed to figure out the way to open this door lock. And so, of course, he said, it's magic. I figured out the magic trick to be able to open the door lock. And the grandmother asked him, well, why do you think you've got the magic? And he says, well, it's because, Poppy, who's his grandfather, Terrence Vinson, loves me. So that's why he must have given me the magic so I can open the door lock. And I thought that it was very interesting because it's actually kind of instructive to me about how miracles work in regular life anyway, is because people misunderstand what's really happening and then attribute it to miracles, right? And so he was saying that just like that with God, God loves us and so we can have miracles in our lives. And just like that kid, he just didn't understand what was really happening, that he just managed to get the skill to open the door lock. It wasn't magic. I think that happens a lot for people who see miracles in their lives. So it was kind of an analogy which I don't know if it necessarily gave across the exact right message that he wanted to give across.
Sure. How about you, Mike? Do you have anything else you want to talk about?
Well, I think I would be very ungrateful if I didn't mention the fly, which was buzzing around Elder Vincent's face. That was like the talk. I was watching Twitter. It was the talk of Twitter. Nobody was listening. I'm glad, Scott, that you were paying attention to this talk because I don't think anybody else heard anything he said because this fly was just constantly on his face.
Yeah, it was landing on his nose and, annoying him, and he had to keep it together, but you could tell he was not happy about it.
Well, I do want to say, too, one other positive thing about his talk. He did talk about how intent is important, so actual actions that we do doesn't really matter what we do as long as the intent isn't there. So, obviously I can do the right thing all the time, but if I have a wrong intention or if I have a bad intention, then that's not helping me. Or I can have good intentions to do something. As long as I have the intent behind what I'm doing is really the important thing. And I thought that was actually kind of a good message as well.
Yeah. I'm going to take us on a tangent here, not a tangent to conference, but I'm going to make us rewind to Quentin Cook's talk, and that I found it interesting. I don't necessarily have too much to say about it, but Scott, you were talking about how he talked about the literal gathering of Israel, and that Mormons believe in the literal gathering of Israel. But then he goes on to actually say, but actually Nelson says it's not a physical gathering, but more a gathering of commitment, And I was just like,
yes.
Does he know what literal means? Like, I don't know. Like, it seems like he doesn't know what literal means. And then he also, I think Nelson, he got plenty political, but I think Cook also got plenty political, like we already talked about it. And one thing that he was talking about that was interesting, he talked about how we need to be careful of forcing other people to do things that are against their conscience. And he used this idea of, our healthcare providers forced to assist in abortions or things like that if they don't think that they should. And I'm sure there are other examples. But again, a bit more political commentary, I feel, than is sometimes present within General Conference. I don't know.
Yeah. And he specifically came out basically and said, get involved. We need to be involved in the civil activities in our countries. We need to be voting. We need to be doing all that stuff. Of course, he did talk about people being forced to provide abortions when they don't really want to, which, of course, seems like a total straw man again. But, yeah, he was getting very political. And I think there was a number of times during this conference that there was a real effort to get people to get out and to vote and support the church. And Quentin Cook even talked about how we're a minority. He said, we're a minority in the country as far as our views, and we don't have very many allies left. And so we have to redouble our efforts and really work hard to protect, those religious rights that we hold dear.
Yeah, I think that they're probably talking about these kinds of political issues more in General Conference so that there's more of a broad awareness among all the members that, LDS people are a minority, and if something's going to be done about this kind of thing, you got to get out and do it. I think that's becoming more urgent these days. And when he started going towards, people being forced to perform abortions, it reminded me of the argument that I've heard that, if gay marriage is legalized, that the LDS Church might be forced to perform gay marriages in the temple.
Yeah.
And which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because if, you can force a church to perform an ordinance that they disagree with, then it seems like they would have already been forced to perform some sort of heterosexual marriages that they didn't approve of, like interracial marriages, before 1978 or whenever, or, marriages of somebody who's not endowed or not worthy or whatever. But it hasn't happened yet. I'd be surprised if it happened after same-sex marriage is legalized, which it already is in some places.
Yeah. Well, good. Thomas Monson, he closed things out, but he just said, thanks everybody for showing up. We felt the spirit. I don't think he really interjected any opinions on anything like that. How about you guys? Do you have anything else you want to talk about before we wrap things up?
So I do have a question for you guys. So I haven't watched conference for a few years now, and at the very end, it was kind of curious to both me and my wife. We were watching, and as they were walking out of the conference center, each of the members of the Quorum of the 12 had some woman with them on their arm. So they had either their wife, or I think Thomas Monson must have had one of his daughters or someone like that who was with him. And they made a very, very conspicuous effort to walk out arm in arm with the woman in their lives as they left the conference center. Is that something that happens all the time, or is that something that's new?
I don't know. I know that I remember in the past President Hinckley walking in with his wife up to the podium, and then her taking her leave and sitting wherever she sat. Do you know, Mike?
Yeah, I don't really know, and I can't recall. And I'll be honest, I was having a few mild drinks, and I really had to leave the room to go pee, so I didn't actually see that.
No, I actually, as soon as the closing talk was over, I stopped watching, so I didn't catch it either. That is interesting, though. I wonder if they are trying to be more conspicuous and right, at least on the face of things, saying, "Hey, we love the women in our lives. Stop telling us that we don't," type of thing.
Yeah, well, President Monson's talk finished really early, it felt like. It was like 1:45, so there's 15 minutes left. They had the final song, and then they spent a good 6 or 7 minutes with the cameras trained on all of the members of the Quorum of the 12 as they're walking out arm in arm with with a wife or whoever it might have been. And it felt very much like they were trying to elevate that, to show, we do respect the women in our lives. They are important to us. I've seen a lot lately in the church trying to portray that the leaders of the church are partnerships, between the wife and the priesthood leader. And I just wonder if that was part of what they were trying to go for. It was just interesting.
Yeah, could be. Well, guys, thanks for participating. Thanks for enduring conference to gather your thoughts and coming on and talking about it with us. I really appreciate you guys being here.
Yeah, thank you. Somehow I always end up watching it all, even though I don't really want to. But it just has that effect now that I'm interested.
Fair enough.
Now that I no longer believe it.
All right, and thanks to everybody who's tuning in to these General Conference reviews and listening to Mormon Expositor in general. We appreciate you guys' listenership, and we will talk to you guys later. Bye.
All right, see you guys.
Thanks, see ya.
When I gave my heart to you, I swore it would only be for you, but I said that before you broke my heart. When the feelings you feel of you, I can't share mine with you. The lump of pain in my throat won't let me start, and I wish that I didn't ignore. The broken hearts get broken more. Sometimes in our lives we learn things done come back in turn. What did I do to earn nothing from you? In life, the mistakes I've had don't do me any bad, till I can't handle sad things I've been through. I can learn from mistakes and from sins, but I make them again and again. I wanna fly above the oceans of tears that I've cried, to look down on myself and ask why. For you I won't change me again. It's hard enough that I am who I am. There's so many people who haven't walked in my shoes, but they say that they choose still to be me. Looking at me outside seems like a pleasure ride. I wonder which side of me they would be. I smile to hide all my fears, but still I can't hold back the tears. Oh, I wanna fly, to lose myself up in the skies, so that rain doesn't come from my eyes, and I can't hide behind all these lies. It's time to remove my disguise. There's so much of me I've missed, trying to get that kiss. She said, wear clothes like this. I said, okay. I've been stomped in the ground, molded and twisted round, so long before I found I'm not just clay. I'm worried what others might see, instead of seeking approval from me. I wanna fly so fast that my past passes by, to erase such a great guy. Why can't I look me in the eyes? I want to begin to think of me the way that I am, to forget all the people I've been. I've figured out reasons for why. Now I'll just give me one more last try.